there is an hour that most people will never know. It is not a secret hour. It is not hidden away in some remote monastery or locked behind the gates of wealth, status, or extraordinary talent. It is freely available to every single person on this earth, every single day. Yet, its streets remain completely empty. Its silence goes undisturbed. Why? Because to enter this hour, you must pay a toll that most people in our modern, softly cushioned world are simply no longer willing to pay. That toll is discomfort. We live in an age of frictionless existence. We have engineered our entire lives to avoid the cold, the dark, and the difficult. We want immediate answers. We want instant warmth. We want effortless success delivered to our doorstep with a tap on a glass screen. But the universe does not reward the effortless. It rewards the intentional. And there is little more intentional than leaving a warm bed while the rest of the world is deeply asleep. That quietest hour is 5 a.m. Think about the sheer chaotic noise of your average day, the endless notifications, the rapid-fire emails, the demands from your boss, your colleagues, your family, your friends. From the very second you open your eyes and look at your phone, someone is asking you for something. Your attention is fractured into 1,000 tiny shards, scattered to the wind before your feet have even touched the floor. You start the day in a deficit. You start the day on defense. But 5 a.m. is different. 5 a.m. is a fortress. It is a sanctuary of profound, unbroken silence. No one expects anything from you at 5 a.m. The phone does not ring. The inbox does not demand your immediate reply. The relentless machinery of society has paused its grinding gears. The world is asleep, and in that heavy, peaceful slumber, there is a gap, a beautiful, empty space where you can finally hear your own voice, your own breathing, and your own thoughts. You might be telling yourself right now that you are simply not a morning person. You might believe your circadian rhythm dictates a later schedule. It is true that we all have natural biological clocks, but it is also true that our modern environment, with its artificial lights, late-night screens, and perpetual stress, frequently hijacks those clocks. The warmth of a heavy blanket feels exactly the same to a highly successful executive as it does to an entry-level clerk. The darkness outside the window at 4:55 in the morning is just as cold and uninviting no matter who you are. The physical protest of the body, the heavy eyelids, the urge to retreat into sleep, these are universal human experiences. The difference between those who rise and those who sleep is not always a matter of innate biology. Often, it is a deliberate decision to reclaim the day before it reclaims you. In the following chapters, you will hear the story of James Cole. James is a man who possessed everything on paper, yet felt exhausted in reality. A man who was slowly drowning in the shallow, frantic waters of his own busy life, running as fast as he could just to stay in the exact same place. He is a man just like many of us. Until one morning, he met a stranger on a park bench who introduced him to the transformative power of the quietest hour. As you listen to James's journey, ask yourself one vital question. What is the noise of your current life costing you? What dreams, what ideas, and what quiet revelations are being drowned out by the constant static of your daily routine? And more importantly, who could you become if you dared to claim the very first hour of the day for yourself? The world will wake eventually. It always does. The noise will return. The demands will begin, but right now, it is just you, the dark, and the choice. The quietest hour is waiting. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Man Who Had Everything. James Cole woke at 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday and immediately reached for his phone. He did this before his eyes had fully adjusted to the pale morning light filtering through the bedroom blinds. He did this before he had taken a conscious breath, and long before he had taken a moment to decide who he was going to be that day. He did not need to decide. The phone was already deciding for him. The screen illuminated his face in the semi-darkness with a harsh, artificial glow. The notifications were stacked like demands from a restless crowd. 47 unread emails, 3 missed calls from the overseas office, a calendar so relentlessly full, block after block of solid color that it looked less like a schedule and more like a prison sentence. James looked at the glowing rectangle in his hand and felt the familiar weight settle onto his chest. It was a physical pressure, a dull, aching tightening in his lungs that had become so constant over the years he had almost forgotten what it felt like to draw a full, unrestricted breath. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and sat there for a moment, rubbing his face. He was exhausted. Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from a hard day of physical labor, which can be cured by a good night of sleep. This was a deeper, more insidious kind of fatigue. It was a weariness of the mind. Yet, by every measurable metric of modern society, James was successful. He had the title. He was a senior vice president at a firm whose name commanded respect. He had the salary, a number that would have sounded like absolute freedom to him a decade ago. He had the house in the right neighborhood, with the perfectly manicured lawn and the right car parked in the driveway. He had spent his entire adult life carefully collecting the universally agreed upon symbols of a good life. He had climbed the ladder, rung by rung, sacrificing evenings and weekends to get to the top. But the view from the top looked remarkably like a treadmill. Every single morning, for the past 6 years, James had woken up with the exact same sinking sensation. The feeling that he was already behind. Before his feet even touched the hardwood floor, the race had begun, and he was already losing. He was already late, though he could never quite name what he was late for. He rushed through his shower. He rushed through his coffee. He rushed his goodbyes to his wife, offering a distracted kiss, while simultaneously typing a reply to a client with his other hand. His days were a blur of motion. They were filled with back-to-back meetings, where a lot was said, but very little was actually accomplished. He was managing crises and responding to the loudest voice in the room. He was moving at lightning speed, executing tasks with ruthless efficiency. But efficiency is not the same thing as effectiveness. During a brief, rare moment of quiet in his corner office that afternoon, James stared out the floor-to-ceiling window at the sprawling city below. Millions of people were hurrying just like him. Taxis weaving through traffic, pedestrians rushing down the sidewalks, everyone looking down at their screens, moving with desperate urgency. He watched them and felt a sudden, profound emptiness. He had everything he had ever been told to want, and he felt nothing. The expensive suit he wore felt like a costume. The important title on his door felt like a label on an empty box. He was dedicating the best hours of his days to maintaining a machine that did not seem to care if he was ground into dust in the process. James turned back to his desk as his computer chimed with another urgent email. He sat down, the stone on his chest feeling a little heavier. He was beginning to realize a terrifying truth, a truth that would completely unravel the life he had built if he ever dared to look at it directly. Busyness is not purpose, and speed no matter how breathtaking, is not direction. Chapter 2. The Stranger on the Bench. It was his wife who sent him out that morning. There was no argument, no raised voices. She simply sat across from him at the breakfast table at 7 a.m., her hands resting around a warm mug, and watched him. She watched the dark, heavy circles under his eyes. She watched the rigid posture of his shoulders, pulled up toward his ears as if bracing for an impact. Most of all, she watched the phone in his hand, a device he could not manage to put down to look her in the eye. She reached across the table, gently placed her hand over his screen, and said 4 simple words. "Go get some air." James almost argued. His instinct to resist flared up immediately. He had calls to make. He had urgent emails to answer. He had a massive presentation at 9 that he had been actively avoiding for 3 days. His mind was already a whirlwind of logistics and obligations. But something in her expression stopped him. It was a look he had not seen before. It felt less like a casual request and more like a quiet intervention from someone watching a man slowly drown in shallow water. So he grabbed his coat and went. The air outside was crisp, carrying the sharp bite of early morning. James walked aimlessly for a few blocks until he found himself at the entrance of the small neighborhood park. It was a place he drove past every day but hadn't actually walked through in years. The gravel crunched beneath his dress shoes as he walked down the main path. The park was mostly empty at that hour, save for a few distant dog walkers. But on the third bench from the entrance, sitting perfectly still, was an older man. He wore a thick, worn gray coat and held a battered silver thermos in his lap. He was pouring a cup of steaming coffee into the lid, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't looking at the coffee, nor was he looking at a phone. He was simply watching the sky transition from the deep black of night to the fragile blue of early morning. James stopped on the path. There was a distinct stillness about the man. In a city vibrating with anxiety and speed, this man sitting on a cold wooden bench looked entirely at peace. James felt a strange magnetic pull. His chest, which had been tight since the moment he woke up, felt incredibly heavy. Without overthinking his schedule or his waiting inbox, James walked over and sat down on the far edge of the bench. For a few minutes, neither of them said a word. The only sound was the rustling of bare branches overhead and the distant hum of morning traffic. Then the older man glanced over. He didn't offer a polite, dismissive nod. He just looked at James with a calm, observant clarity, took a slow sip from his thermos, and spoke. "You look," the man said, his voice steady and grounded, like a man who has been awake for years but hasn't actually slept once. James stopped breathing for a second. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. He opened his mouth to reply, intending to offer a sarcastic joke or proudly list his job title and responsibilities to justify his exhaustion. But the words died in his throat. He couldn't bring himself to lie to this stranger, and in that quiet moment, he realized he was too tired to keep lying to himself. We often expect life-changing moments to arrive with flashing lights, dramatic events, or catastrophic failures. We expect them to be loud, but the most profound shifts usually arrive in everyday moments. Sometimes, the right conversation with the exact right person at the absolute right moment can change the entire direction of a life. Chapter 3. The first morning, the old man introduced himself simply as Arthur. He did not offer a last name, and James, still processing the sudden clarity of the man's observation, did not ask. There was an ease about him that made formal introductions feel unnecessary. You do not always need a person's entire history to understand their character. Arthur poured a second cup of coffee into his thermos lid and set it on the wooden space between them. The steam curled upward, disappearing into the cold air. I have been coming to this exact bench at 5 a.m. every morning for 11 years, Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the stillness of the park. James looked at him, genuinely surprised. Every morning? Why? Did a doctor tell you to? Did you read about it in a book? Arthur chuckled, a low, warm sound. No, James. Nobody told me to do it. There was no grand plan or productivity seminar. 11 years ago, I was exactly where you are right now. I was running a company, managing a family, and answering to 100 different voices every single day. I was so busy keeping the plates spinning, I completely forgot why I started spinning them in the first place. James swallowed hard. The description felt entirely too familiar. Then, one Tuesday, I woke up at exactly 5 a.m., Arthur continued. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with all the things I had to fix, the emails I had to answer, and the people I felt I was failing. The anxiety was a physical weight. He took a slow sip of his coffee. I knew if I stayed in bed, I would just stare at the ceiling and panic. So, I put my coat over my pajamas, walked out the front door, and wandered until I found this bench. I sat down, and I waited for the world to begin its noise. Arthur turned his head, his pale eyes meeting James's exhausted gaze. But the noise didn't start right away, Arthur said softly. For the first time in decades, I was forced to sit in unbroken silence. No phone ringing, no employees asking for direction. Just silence. James leaned forward slightly, caught in the rhythm of the story. And do you know what happens when you sit in silence for long enough? Arthur asked. James shook his head slowly. You finally start to hear something you have been drowning out for years. You hear yourself. Arthur looked back out at the trees. In that quiet, I heard my own thoughts, completely uninterrupted. I heard my own breath moving steadily, and I heard my own heartbeat. It was a very quiet, persistent reminder that I was still alive, and that being alive meant I still had time. A gentle, weathered smile crossed Arthur's face. That single morning changed everything. Not dramatically, not all at once, but like all real changes, it happened slowly, and then suddenly. He pointed a finger toward the city skyline, just beginning to catch the morning light. The world will try to sell you the idea that waking up early is about getting more work done. They will tell you it's a life hack to beat your competitors or clear your inbox. Arthur leaned closer. They are wrong. The 5 a.m. hour is not about productivity, James. It is about reclaiming yourself before the world takes you. James sat perfectly still. The tight, heavy stone that had been sitting on his chest since he woke up felt inexplicably lighter. The anxiety that usually vibrated beneath his skin was fading, replaced by a strange sense of calm. He looked down at his right coat pocket. His phone was in there. He knew there were dozens of emails waiting, and he knew his 9 o'clock presentation was still unprepared. But for the first time in 6 years, James simply listened. He let the device stay in the dark, and he did not reach for it. Chapter 4. The 20-20-20 Formula. Arthur met James at the park every morning for the next week. James did not consciously plan this routine. He simply woke up at 5 a.m. the morning after their first meeting and found himself reaching for his winter coat before his mind could construct a reasonable argument against it. Something had quietly shifted. They sat on the same wooden bench. For the first few days, they spoke very little. James was learning how to exist in the silence without reaching for his phone as a protective shield. Arthur seemed content to simply let the quiet do its work. But on the fourth morning, the temperature had dropped. A thick layer of condensation had formed on the outside of Arthur's thermos. Arthur reached out and, with a deliberate finger, drew 3 distinct circles in the moisture on the metal. James watched him, his breath visible in the freezing air. "What is that?" Arthur traced the first circle again. "This is the framework of the quietest hour. I call it the 20-20-20 formula." He tapped the first circle. 20 minutes, Arthur began. "Move your body. You mean a workout? Like going to the gym?" "I simply mean move," Arthur clarified. "Do not do it for aesthetics, and do not do it for anyone else. Move, because this body is yours. It is the only one you will ever have, and it has been sitting in an office chair for 6 years, slowly forgetting what it was built for." He moved his finger to the second circle. "The next 20 minutes, grow your mind." James thought of his endless stacks of industry reports. "I read all day at work." "Not the news, and definitely not your emails," Arthur replied, shaking his head. "Read nothing that someone else needs from you. Read a book that challenges your perspective. Study history or art or the biographies of people who have built interesting lives. For 20 minutes, feed your intellect with ideas that make you larger than you were yesterday." And finally, Arthur's finger moved to the third circle. "The final 20 minutes?" Arthur said softly. "Feed your spirit." James stayed quiet. He knew this was the part of his life he had neglected the longest. "Sit in silence," Arthur instructed. "Write in a journal. Pray, if you are a person who prays. Or just sit and think about the direction of your life. But you must give 20 minutes to the part of yourself that has absolutely nothing to do with your job title or your bank balance." Arthur wiped the thermos clean with his sleeve, erasing the circles, but leaving the blueprint clear in James's mind. 60 minutes, Arthur said, taking a sip of his coffee. "That is all it takes. Move, grow, reflect." He turned to look at the younger man. "It is 60 minutes before the rest of the world begins. And once you claim those 60 minutes, the world will never be able to take them from you." Chapter 5. The Resistance. By the second week, James almost quit. The novelty had completely worn off. The romantic idea of reclaiming his mornings collided with the very real physical inertia of changing a deeply ingrained routine. The initial burst of inspiration faded, leaving behind only the cold reality of an early alarm. For 3 consecutive mornings, he turned off that alarm. He lay in the warm, heavy dark of his bedroom, listening to the voice in his head list every reasonable excuse to stay in bed. He was tired. He had a stressful day ahead. He had earned the rest. He told himself he would simply start again tomorrow. Tomorrow. It is, perhaps, the most expensive word in the English language. It quietly bankrupts our potential, day by day, while convincing us that we still have plenty of time. On the 4th morning, a Thursday, the alarm went off at exactly 5 a.m. The same overwhelming wave of exhaustion crashed over him. The warm bed acted like a magnet, pulling him down toward unconsciousness. But this time, before his mind could construct a single rational argument, James forced his torso upright. He swung his legs over the side of the mattress and planted his feet on the floor. He sat on the edge of the bed in the pitch black for a full 60 seconds. He did not move. He just sat there, feeling every cell in his body protest. He felt the phantom warmth of the pillows calling him backward. And then he stood up. He did not stand up because he felt good. He was not suddenly overflowing with energy. He stood up because he remembered something Arthur had told him on the bench. Motivation is a guest, Arthur had said, watching the morning sky. It visits sometimes, and it leaves without warning. You cannot rely on a guest to shelter you. Arthur had turned to look at him with a steady gaze. Discipline is the house. You have to build the house first. Standing in the cold dark of his bedroom, James finally understood what the old man meant. He had spent his life waiting for the feeling of motivation to arrive before taking action. He thought he needed to feel inspired to change his life. But the truth is, motivation follows action. Never the other way around. You do not act because you feel like it. You act, and then you feel like it. You force the body to move, and eventually, the mind catches up. James walked out of the bedroom and headed toward the kitchen. He did not feel invincible that morning. His workout was slow, his reading felt dense, and his 20 minutes of silence were filled with intrusive thoughts about work. It was messy. It was imperfect. But when he finally walked into his office at 8:30 that morning, he realized he had already won the hardest battle of the day. The house of discipline was quietly being built, one morning at a time. Chapter 6. What James Found in the Silence. By the third week, something entirely unexpected happened. James started looking forward to 5 a.m. It was not a sudden, magical transformation into a morning person. The alarm did not suddenly sound like a gentle invitation. The hardwood floor was still freezing against his bare feet. The darkness outside the window was still heavy, and the physical effort required to force his body into motion was still immense. No, he did not look forward to the waking up part, but he deeply, quietly began to crave the hour itself. He craved the silence of it, the sheer emptiness of the house. He craved the way the world felt before it became loud, before the engines of the morning commute started to rumble, before the tidal wave of emails breached his inbox, before the constant low-level hum of societal anxiety began to vibrate through the walls of his life. Because he had finally stopped rushing, he started noticing things. Ordinary things that he had never noticed in 7 years of living in the exact same house on the exact same street. He noticed the way the stairs creaked in a specific rhythm when he walked down to the kitchen. He noticed the distinct aroma of the coffee beans when he opened the jar. He noticed the sound of his own breathing, slow and measured in the quiet room. But most of all, he noticed the sky. During the final 20 minutes of his morning routine, the time Arthur had dedicated to reflection, James began sitting by the large bay window in his living room. He didn't read. He didn't write. He simply held his warm mug and watched. He watched a spectacular transition in nature happening right over his neighborhood. It unfolded in the 20 brief minutes between 5 a.m. and 5:20 a.m. It was a color gradient so slow and so precise, it felt almost engineered. He watched the deep, impenetrable black of the night sky slowly begin to yield. The black softened into a blue so dark it was almost purple. Then, very slowly, that purple surrendered to the first tentative gray of the morning, a soft slate gray that washed over the quiet street gently revealing the silhouettes of the bare oak trees. And finally, just before his 60 minutes were up, that high gray sky would catch the first faint warmth of gold, a silent, glowing promise of the day to come. It was a daily masterpiece, a quiet performance of light and time, happening completely free of charge, right above his roof, every single day. And he had never seen it, not once. For 7 years, he had lived in this house. He had paid the mortgage, and he had parked his car in the driveway. And for 7 years, he had been entirely asleep. For all of it, sitting by the window, James felt a strange mixture of awe and sadness. He realized that he hadn't just been physically asleep in his bed during those hours. He had been asleep at the wheel of his own existence. When you are moving at 100 miles an hour, your vision naturally narrows. You develop tunnel vision. You only see what is directly in front of you. The next urgent meeting. The next looming deadline. The next client crisis. Everything else becomes a blur in the periphery. James realized, taking a slow sip of his coffee as the first golden light hit the glass, that speed is a remarkably effective blindfold. We convince ourselves that moving faster means we are experiencing more of life. We think busyness equals importance. But the opposite is true. When you finally slow down, you begin to see everything that speed was hiding from you. Chapter 7. The morning Arthur was not there. On a Thursday in the 5th week, James arrived at the park at 4:58 a.m. The gravel crunched under his boots, a familiar sound that had become part of his new rhythm. He walked toward the third bench from the entrance, expecting to see the gray coat and the silver thermos. But the bench was empty. James sat down and rested his coffee on the wooden slats. He pulled his coat a little tighter against the morning chill, and he waited. 5 a.m. quietly arrived, and then passed. The sky remained dark. Then it was 5:10 a.m. Then 5:20. Arthur did not come. In the past, James would have immediately filled an empty, waiting moment by pulling out his phone. He would have checked his emails, scrolled through notifications, or let a wave of anxiety wash over him regarding the disruption to his routine. But as he sat alone on the cold bench, James realized he was not reaching for his pocket. He sat with his coffee and noticed a feeling he had not expected to feel. He did not feel worry. He did not feel disappointment or frustration. He felt completeness, sitting in the quiet of the park, watching the early light slowly begin to trace the outlines of the trees. James understood that he no longer needed Arthur to be there. It was not because the older man had not mattered. Arthur had been the catalyst. But the scaffolding was no longer necessary because the foundation had already been laid. The lessons of the quietest hour, the 20-20-20 formula, the discipline of waking up before the world began its noise, those things had already taken root deep within him. James reached into his coat pocket. He bypassed his phone entirely and pulled out the small leather-bound journal he had started carrying. He opened it to a blank page. The paper felt crisp in the cold air. He uncapped his pen and wrote 4 simple words across the top line. Who am I becoming? He did not put a question mark at the end of the sentence. He was no longer asking the universe to define him the way he had let his job title and his busy calendar define him for the last decade. He was setting a course. It was not a question. It was a direction. James closed the journal and took a slow, deep breath of the freezing air as the sun finally broke over the horizon. A great mentor does not create a follower. A great mentor teaches you, step by step, how to walk on your own. they guide you just long enough to show you that your own foundation is solid, teaching you to eventually need no mentor at all. That is not an ending. That is the whole point. Chapter 8. Before the World Wakes. 6 months later, James still woke at 5 a.m. Not every morning. He was honest with himself about that. He had not suddenly transformed into an infallible machine. There were mornings when the alarm lost the battle. There were mornings when a late flight, a winter cold, or simply the heavy rain made the bed too comforting to leave. On those days, the bed won. But most mornings, 5 days out of 7, sometimes 6, he was up before the world. And in that hour, he was entirely, completely his own. His external life had not changed in any cinematic way. He had not quit his corporate job to go live in the woods. His salary was roughly the same. His calendar, when he finally opened it at 8:30, was still full of meetings and obligations. But something fundamental had shifted in the way he moved through those days. He was no longer perpetually behind. He was no longer losing the race before he had even tied his shoes. He arrived at every meeting already having won something that morning. He had already moved his body, grown his mind, and sat in the quiet. He had given himself something that no demanding client and no sudden crisis could ever take back. He thought about Arthur often. He never saw the old man again at the bench after that Thursday. After a few weeks, James had actually started asking around. He asked the city worker who emptied the park trash cans and the barista at the corner coffee shop. No one knew an older man named Arthur who came to the park every morning at 5 a.m. James always smiled when he thought about this. Some things you are not meant to explain. Some gifts arrive without a return address, handed to you exactly when you are ready to receive them. You do not need to endlessly analyze the gift. You simply receive it. You use it to rebuild your foundation. And then, when the time is right, you look for someone else who is drowning in the noise, and you pass it on. The quietest hour, James realized, is not a routine. It is not a life hack. It is not a productivity tool to squeeze more labor out of an exhausted schedule. It is a philosophy. It is a quiet, daily declaration that before the world wakes up to make its endless demands, your life belongs to you. Conclusion: your first morning. Tomorrow morning, the alarm will go off. And in that moment, in the dark, in the warmth, in that fragile gap between sleep and waking, you will make a decision. It will feel small. It will feel entirely insignificant. It will feel like just another regular morning. And the voice in your head will tell you that resting for just a few more minutes is the logical, harmless choice. It is not. It is the morning you decide who you are becoming. It is the moment you choose whether you will continue to be a passenger in your own life, reacting to the noise of others, or whether you will step into the driver's seat and claim the quietest hour for yourself. So, here is what you must do tonight. Set the alarm for 5 a.m. Put the clock across the room. Put it in the hallway or the bathroom. Put it anywhere that forces your physical body to stand up, to break the heavy pull of the mattress, and to face the day before you can reach out and silence the noise. And when it goes off tomorrow at 5 a.m. and your body protests the cold, I want you to remember James. Remember the heavy stone on his chest and how it felt to live an entire decade out of breath, constantly running but never arriving. Remember Arthur. Remember the bench, the changing colors of the early sky, and the profound, unbroken silence of the park. Do not wait for motivation to pull you out of bed. Build the house of discipline instead. Step into the quiet room. Move your body. Grow your mind. Feed your spirit. Remember the hour that belongs to absolutely no one but you. The world will wake eventually. The emails will arrive, the demands will start, and the chaos of the day will resume its usual pace. It always does. But tomorrow, when the world finally wakes, you will already be standing. You will have already won your morning. You will be ready for it.
This concludes our journey today. Thank you for listening. If you found value in this, please leave a like. It really helps the channel. I'd also love to hear your favorite takeaway in the comments below. Subscribe for more audiobooks, and I'll see you in the next one.